The procession for the betrothal took the long road on purpose, so every eye in the capital could be taught the shape of surrender. Banners like slices of sunrise hung from balcony to balcony. Drums rolled in the throat of the city. Vendors practiced their bittersweet congratulations, my lady tones. On the high terrace, the queen held her face like a door set barely ajar, and below, beneath the shimmering canopy of the archive, 1,000 citizens rehearsed the polite posture of people who have decided to be brave tomorrow instead. Arya walked between the ranks with the light on her shoulders and the wrong future in her mouth. Like a coin she had been forced to bite. She wore the sapphire mail of her house, a lattice, so fine it caught the sun and braided it into something milder, and a coronet that hovered a thumb's width above her brow. Indecisive crown of an indecisive arrangement. Her mask was translucent, not opaque. Her tutors called it a compromise, as if showing the world her eyes could make up for selling the rest of her life by the pound. The Duke's envoy waited at the foot of the dais, a dozen figures in iron that refused sculpture. Joints honest, edges practical. Their commander holding a copy of the contract with the pious air of a man delivering a sacred text to a congregation he did not respect. Lutheran of the Iron Meridian Luth, to those who had known him before the armor had learned his breath, would arrive by sundown. For now, his letterhead did the damage. Arya's stomach had felt too heavy for days, as if someone had folded an anvil into her breakfast. She climbed the steps anyway, because a princess is a verb before she is a person. At the top, on the last riser where ceremony forces the body to hesitate long enough to become symbol, she paused and saw him. He wore a guard's brown, the cheap kind that takes a polish if bullied. The sun made a problem out of his hair. His jaw had the look of something carved by someone who loved acorns and horses more than stone. His name was Jace. Arya knew, because she knew her guards the way generals know their maps. And he was new enough that the uniform still believed it was costume. When her gaze brushed his, he did the unforgivable thing and held it. Deference broke around his eyes, like water around a stone. They had decided it would be river shape, but not river obedient. Move, she told herself. Smile, nod at the envoy. Pretend the pen will not be a blade. The queen's hand warm, dry, smelling faintly of the oil used to keep antique pistols from remembering their first jobs, rested on Arya's wrist. Daughter, she said without moving her lips, we endure and then we make change. Sometimes in that order, sometimes in both. Arya nodded, a monarch's nod, useless as a bandage over a broken law. She took the stylus. The archive's surface rippled, a glass lake remembering storms. Somewhere beneath the city, the singing rift turned in its sleep. By witness of light and ledger, intoned the envoy. By witness of people, Arya countered out of reflex, old phrase of an older house. The envoy blinked. The queen's mouth considered a smile and declined. Arya lowered the stylus. Jace moved before she understood. She had looked at him for permission. It wasn't a dramatic rush. It was the practical step of a man whose body had been asked by a look to be in a different square on the board. He crossed the space between guard's rank and dais, with just enough speed to be bravery and not enough to be treason yet. The other guards reached for him and then didn't. Something in the line of his back said, this is rehearsal and also the show. He took the last step in a single breath and stood not in front of her. No man could stand between a princess and a pen, but beside her, where a friend might. My lady, he said, soft and incorrect, using human instead of title. May I offer you a piece of information? It was not a question. It bowed like one. The envoy's iron twitched. Remove him. Name the information. The queen said, voice the exact weight of a coin. Jace's eyes didn't leave Arya's. The Iron Meridian's contract contains an annex you were not shown. Clause 8, appended by courier at dawn, signed only by the Duke's council, not by the Duke. It binds your firstborn to their military academy at 12, without appeal. He lifted his hand, and in it, like a conjurer guilty of honesty, a thin slate glimmered. The annex reflected into a private, channeled by a bored scribe and intercepted by a guard who sometimes fixed the palace routers when the real technicians were busy. The archive brightened as if to see better. The envoy's mask tilted. Forgery? Verification? The queen asked the archive, almost conversational. Light deepened, sorted itself, gave a small approval chime. genuine. The square was very suddenly a different country. People leaned forward into the future, the way plants lean toward rain. Somewhere, a child asked, too loud, "Does that mean the princess can say no?" And a mother shushed him in the absolute traditional language of mothers everywhere. Arya's pulse stopped being a problem and became an instrument. She turned toward the envoy. "Withdraw the annex. I have no such instruction." "Then withdraw the envoy," the queen said, and the guard captain, grateful to be told to do something with his hands, lifted 2 fingers. The Iron delegation stepped back as if choreography had rehearsed this rupture. "Chase," Arya said, tasting the name, finding the syllable that held the steadiness. "Thank you." He bowed without flourish. "I am at your command." "Then obey me," she said. "When I say run." He didn't move. "My lady, run with me," she said, voice still court-smooth and therefore outrageous. Before they find a prettier chain, the queen's hand tightened once on Arya's wrist and let go. It was blessing. It was apology. It was a door opening. Arya turned and did the unforgivable. She left a contract unfinished. Jace moved as if the stones had promised to be rowed. He flanked her without crowding, 1 step off and a half behind, the geometry of guard and also of companion. And together, they took the service stairs behind the dais, the narrow ones, where light came down in slanted strips, and the city could be viewed in slices, like a life being evaluated by an impatient god. "Left," Jace said once, and then duck, and then nearly there, as if words could lay boards over gaps. The palace became kitchen steam, and the smell of onions, then the cool of the archives under bones, then the noise of markets, a sudden flood of people who had waited years for this particular story, and would now have the decency to pretend to be surprised by it. They reached the Garden of Comets, where the light falls slower, where lovers who are also conspirators traditionally discover they have the same hands. Arya pressed her back to a pillar and breathed. Memory came like grief, and left like plan. "You will be recorded as kidnapper," she said. "I can be what the record calls me," he said. "I intend to be what you call me." "What should I call you?" she asked, startling herself with the hunger in it. "Useful," he said, and smiled like a man apologizing to a door he was about to unlock. They did not plan a revolution. They planned a route. Revolutions, Arya had learned, are what you call a series of routes after they work. "Outer South Gate is iron," Jace said, eyes flicking along the garden's colonnade to the service arch, where deliveries came in under the noses of soldiers who had been told not to see. "So is the West. The East we can buy with confusion. The North is yours." "Not anymore," she said. "My Aunt Selene took the northern keys when I learned to pick them at 14. Then East." He squinted at the sky the way mechanics squint at engines when they pretend the sun is a gauge. "In 20 minutes, the twin suns will make a glare across the river glass. We walk in that. We will be obvious," she said. "Obvious is a language," he said. "We will speak it so fluently, no one will believe it isn't a dialect of permission." She almost laughed. The feeling came out as a weird hiccup of hope. "Obvious with a princess is kidnapping. Obvious with a princess who just refused a contract is escort," he corrected. "If you raise your chin 3 degrees, and I keep my hand exactly here," he placed it not on her back, not on her arm, but mid-her, a suggestion of a touch that a respectful bodyguard might be making, "then anyone who stops us will be volunteering." To explain why they interpreted duty as interference. "You speak bureaucracy like a native." "I am," he said. "From a long line of people who survived because we learned the accents of those who owned the rooms." "Who owns this room?" she asked, almost idly. "You do," he said, without hesitation. "Until you don't, let's keep it that way." They moved. The east colonnade spilled them into the seam between palace and city, where deliveries are sorted and reputations washed and hung. A woman with flour on her cheek and authority in her posture blocked their way with a cart of figs. "You'll pay for bruises," she said, not looking up. "We already are," Arya said, and the woman, glance flicking to coronet hover and guard's geometry, moved aside without quite meaning to. They reached the river glass-broad plate of fused sand that served as road, mirror, and calendar. It threw the suns back at themselves and turned everyone walking it into brighter versions or cooler, depending on how a person felt about their own face. Arya stepped into the glare. The world vanished around the edges. Only a head remained, Where? She asked. Outpost 12, Jace said. Old tunnel mouth under the Scholar's Quarter. The Meridian thinks it collapsed. It did not. We keep it swept, because knowledge prefers exits. You talk like a librarian. I am, he said, and she realized he meant it literally. Guard is my second job. First is keeping books from being eaten by time and men. A shout arced behind them, more surprise than command. The glare hid the source. A squad would be forming. The archive's tone shifted curiosity, brightening toward concern. Arya adjusted her chin by the instructed 3 degrees and did not increase her pace. Running invites pursuit. Walking invites paperwork. 2 figures detached from a shadowed arcade, ahead one in iron, one in city brown. Jace's breath shortened, not fear, but calculation accelerating. I know him, he said. Duke's adjutant. The other is ours. Ours turned out to be a courier priest from the archive, robe pinned back, breath like a bellows. He slid between Arya and the adjutant with the practiced clumsiness of a man who has learned to weaponize devotion. Blessings of indexes upon you, he said loudly, invoking a rite designed to make anyone who interrupts look like an enemy of classification. The adjutant swallowed a reflex to shove and bowed instead, because reputation is a harness, and he was well trained. Your Highness, the adjutant said, through the computational smile of a man performing respect and trying to compute power. The Duke approaches with apologies for administrative confusion. He requests private conversation. Requests noted, Arya said, not stopping. We are presently engaged in a public one. With whom? My city, she said, and the line moved like a knife, slipped into velvet. They reached the Scholar's Quarter, where balconies leaned like listeners, and the air smelled of ink and heat. Outpost 12 was a door disguised as a bad idea half buried, marked condemned in 3 languages, each misspelled slightly differently. Jace touched the rust just so. The condemnation sighed and turned into an invitation. Inside, dust hung like old arguments. The tunnel fell away into cool. Arya's shoulders dropped a fraction. The world above rearranged itself into a hunting party that would take time to agree on rules. How far? She asked. 3 turns, he said. Then a lift. Then the silence. The silence? The part of the city that forgot it had a voice, he said. Places like that are generous if you tell them who they are. They took the turns. The lift groaned and then remembered its job, hauling them down into cool breath and stone wet with old conversations. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a chamber where light filtered in from impossible angles, gratings, cracks, thefts. Shelves had been carved from the walls. Books slept there, shocked into survival by the humility of being underground. A kettle sat on a brazier, like a joke about priorities. A cot waited with its hands folded. This is your second job, Arya said, the laugh finally arriving with interest. First, he said, this is what I am. Guarding is a way to keep this open, and to keep me from closing, she said, not a question. You're not a door, he said. You're a road. Roads don't close. People build barricades on them and call that safety. She looked at his hands. They were the kind that learn how to repair, not only how to hold. Why help me? She asked, soft enough that the question would not bruise. Because you asked, he said simply. And then, after a breath, and because the Meridian does not marry wives so much as it acquires leverage. I have seen what that makes of queens. I prefer governments that let children be 12. Something loosened in her that had been made tight by tutors and treaty and the sincere terror of being wrong in public. Thank you, she said, and meant it like a drink of water. Above, a bell took breath for a proclamation. The Queen would be speaking. The city would be holding itself in a new shape. The Duke would be arriving with a bouquet of regrets and a pocketful of substitutions. Here, the kettle began to sing. We cannot hide long, Jace said. We can choose where to be found. And how, she said. And by whom, he added. Then let us decide, Arya said, straightening the coronet so it hovered a hair nearer commitment, disguised as cosmetics. If the Meridian wants a spectacle, we will give them one that bends in our direction. Jace smiled. There is a service exit that opens onto the lecture steps. I can put you where your words will be hardest to ignore. And you? I'll be the man the record calls kidnapper, and the city calls escort, he said. And the Queen will call necessary. The kettle boiled. He poured. They drank, not because tea is armor, but because it teaches hands to be steady. When they climbed again, the tunnel's cool followed them like blessing. The door sighed them back into the day. The glare had softened. The square had sharpened. People were already retelling what had happened, as if they had always hoped they'd get to say it. They stepped into the light as if it had been made to fit them. Guards shifted and did not move. The adjutant put a hand to his ear and remembered not to command. Somewhere close, the Queen's voice began. By the witness of people, Arya felt a map unroll, away from an iron marriage, toward a larger, yes, she could make the city say with her. Jace took half a pace back into the geometry of guard, and for an instant, they were both what the world wanted and precisely what it didn't expect. The wind lifted the edge of her cloak, and the coronet chose. It lowered until it kissed her brow. The lecture steps had taught revolutions how to speak long before anyone dared call them that. Stone worn smooth by argument, balustrades scarred by rings and ink. A wind had edited speeches into something sharper. Students sprawled like cats along the rail. Vendors adopted a professorial air to sell bread with citations. And the archive's feathered light fell through the colonnade in bars. That made honest men look more honest and liars more lyrical. Jace brought Arya up the side passage used by fire wardens and cowardly deans. The crowd was already thickening, drawn by the gravity of rumor and the moon pull of a queen's voice seeded through. Messengers into neighborhoods that had decided to step outside while remembering to pretend they had errands. He placed Arya 2 steps below the top, high enough to be seen, low enough to be reachable. Proximity is policy. By witness of the people, the Queen's voice rolled from a speaking horn, held by an aide with arms like a baker. A clause appended in darkness cannot bind a life in light. My daughter will not sign a chain disguised as curriculum. A murmuration ran through the steps. Relief. Laughter. That tasted like someone had pushed air back into lungs. Anger, too, the useful kind, pointed outward, not at each other. The Duke arrived not as a storm, but as weather you should have prepared for. Iron under a travel cloak, mask polished but not ceremonial. A handful of aides who'd been taught not to sweat in public. Luthrin judged the steps and let them judge him back. He found the Queen's emissary, bowed with the precision of a man cutting cloth, and requested an audience with academic decorum. The emissary gestured at the steps in a way that contained both courtesy and helplessness. Here is the decorum we have, he said. Be welcome. Arya remained where Jace had set her. She did not seek a higher rung. It made arguments climb to reach her. Jace took 2 paces back to a pillar, becoming once more the unremarkable geometry of guard, and in doing so, made more room for attention to sit beside her. The Duke's gaze passed over the crowd, snagged on Arya, saw Jace, and paused. It was not hatred, it was taxonomy. He filed them. Princess, objecting. Guard, problem. Then he put on the smile. All conquerors learn reassuring, reasonable, heavy as a hand on the back of your neck. Your Highness, he called up, voice surprisingly clear through iron. There has been an administrative offense against aesthetics. I did not authorize the annex, and I have publicly cut the hands that tried to bind you with it. He lifted a document. An aide lit the seal. The crowd murmured at the clean theater of retraction. Arya did not take the offered step down. Then rescind the betrothal that produced the annex, and we will both be corrected by the same light. A ripple of approval moved through the students. A professor clapped once, and then remembered he had tenure to think of. The Duke inclined his head. I am prepared to renegotiate. The Meridian does not wish to own a queen. We wish to prevent a war we will otherwise win at ghastly expense. By marrying me, Arya said, the sentence dry as old bread, and making the victory cheaper. By binding our houses, he corrected. 2 locks on the same door, and who holds the keys? Jace murmured to the pillar. The pillar offered no opinion. A courier priest from the archive, perhaps the same one who had weaponized devotion an hour ago, slid between factions with the practiced. Clumsiness of a man who sincerely believed collision was pedagogy. He lifted a small bell that did not ring so much as remind air it had a job. The Queen's emissary lifted the speaking horn toward Arya. She didn't take it. She stepped 1 rung higher instead and let the steps carry her words. If you wanted peace, Arya said, you would have sent teachers, not contracts. A shout, not hostile, rolled down to the river and up again. If you wanted partnership, you would not have hidden a clause inside a morning courier, as if my life were annexed to your convenience. You want leverage, because you do not trust your own laws to keep yours in line. I am tired of being offered the job of making you better against your will. Duke listened without signaling impatience. When she paused, he let the silence define the border between them, and then said, "Then propose a mechanism that costs me something I am willing to pay." It was a better move than most men made under iron. Arya tasted it and found no poison, only the usual metal. "Open session," she said at once. Debate on the treaty articles in the square, 3 days running, with council and archive present. No private dinners. No amendments slid under doors. You bring your poets and your engineers. We bring our clerks and our guilds. We publish the disagreements before we publish an agreement. If at the end the people whistle, we abandon it. The square hissed in pleasure. The Duke's shoulders shifted as if a weight had been moved from one pocket to the other. 3 days, he said, and during those 3, you are not to leave the palace without notice. Not run through the glare like a rumor. Notice to whom? She asked. Me, he said, almost smiling. We are not at war yet. Give me the courtesy of knowing where the problem I respect has gone. Jace's mouth betrayed him by liking the phrasing. Respect can be a kind of leash, but it is better than contempt. Arya caught the flicker and pretended it had been the wind. Agreed, she said. On one condition. The Duke spread a hand. You duel my guard, she said, and the square laughed as if it had been waiting all day for dessert. Disarmament, public, witnessed by archive. He stands for my will to choose. If you cannot unhand him without breaking him, you cannot hold me without ruining me. Jace felt the world tilt under his boots and decided to stand as if it had not. Lutheran looked at him and saw not a clerk this time, but a person, and his chin ticked down a millimeter that Jace filed under respect earned and worry made interesting. Sunset, the Duke said. I accept. Lecture steps, Arya said. Our classroom. Learn here. The interim became pilgrimage. Students ran to fetch friends. Vendors blessed their own foresight in bringing extra oil. The archive shifted its voice to a register that makes history pay attention to itself. Jace did not have a sword. The guard's armory issued spears and patience. A librarian offered a staff used to reach high shelves. Jace took it and kissed the varnish in apology. Advice? He asked Arya, casual, as if asking whether she wanted tea. Answer the question he doesn't know he's asking, she said. And don't bleed where I can see it. I can do one of those, he said. The Duke's people measured the steps like surveyors, calculating the price of dignity. Lutheran moved with the economy of a man who had spent years teaching violence to obey grammar. He drew from his back a pair of short sabers whose edges were honest and whose hilts had learned his fingerprints. He saluted not to Jace, but to the archive, which made Jace like him more than was strategic. Terms, called the courier priest, because the archive adored lists. Disarmament. No humiliation. Hand offered must be taken. No kicks at fallen weapons. No kill. Witnessed. Witnessed, the crowd said back, because saying it makes a body complicit in the decency of what comes next. They began. Lutheran pressed early to test whether Jace would drown himself by trying to swim in iron. Jace did not swim. He redirected. The staff became a verb that made the sabers miss something they had not realized they wanted. He used the steps themselves to change levels, humor flickering in his body as if to say, if lecture is always above, let it be your problem for once. Who taught you? The Duke asked. Conversational as rain. Books, Jace said, and slid the staff between blade and wrist to make the angle of a cut boring. Women twice my age with better balance than my pride. He tapped a hilt and felt the saber consider leaving. It stayed because loyalty is a habit, and the Duke's hands were good at teaching habits. Arya did not cheer. She watched. She counted breaths, steps, the distance between a joke and an injury. The Queen arrived on the upper balcony with the council strung behind her like reluctant pearls. The students began to conduct the crowd, directing shouts to the moments that would best instruct the record. Lutheran shifted. He stopped trying to force a win and began trying to force Jace to choose between two loses. Jace refused the premise with the stubbornness of a man who has worked too long in rooms, where every decision was framed as lesser evil. He created a third option, so plain it looked invisible. Space. The crowd saw it last and liked it most. He took a cut to the forearm to gain it. Not deep, just enough to make his fingers ask questions about their long-term plans. He answered by changing grips and laughing, a small breath of amusement that traveled farther than his voice would have. The square exhaled, as though someone had told it a rude joke in church. Arya's jaw unlocked a fraction. Mercy makes bad soldiers, a Meridian aide muttered to a colleague not softly enough. Mercy makes good cities, the colleague muttered back, surprising himself with his own treason. The turn came with no fanfare. Jace let a saber bind against the staff's ring and stepped into the Duke's reach, where the saber's length made less sense. Bodies became text. Jace read. He hooked a hilt, rotated his wrist, and for one exquisite beat, the saber belonged to both men and neither. He did not wrench. He invited. The saber left politely, as if late for an appointment. It landed 2 risers down and did not skitter because the steps loved a clean ending. Luthran did not curse. He smiled inside the mask Jace could tell by what his shoulders did not do, and pressed with the remaining blade. Jace parried and turned and made a space, and then, instead of taking the easy route to a second disarm, did something ugly and kind. He struck the Duke's thigh hard with the staff's blunt, a thump that will bruise awake tomorrow and complain all week. Pain taught the hand to open. The second saber thunked on stone. Luthran stood unarmed. The crowd found its throat. The courier priest lifted his bell and lowered it, satisfied. The archive braided a cord, so pleased it forgot to be dignified. Jace stepped back and opened his hand. The Duke took it. No hesitation, no theatrics. He let Jace pull him to standing, and then, still holding the hand, raised it between them like a third weapon neither would use. The square quieted, because people know when something that will become a paragraph is happening. Your guard is adequate, Luthran said, which means in Iron Meridian dialect, I would hire him, and in the cities, I will not take your choice easily. My guard is sufficient, Arya returned, which means I will make choices that do not require him to be more than human. They released. The students burst into the kind of applause that makes a life decide to stay on a path. The Queen lifted her chin, the way a person does when they discover the day is joined to their side of the argument. 3 days, Luthran said to Arya, already calculating routes through pride. Then we speak of treaties. 3, she said. Then we speak of choices. Jace bled into his sleeve and pretended not to. Arya pretended to believe him. The city pretended to be surprised at itself and failed charmingly. The archive sang the note it uses when it suspects it will be asked to index something that will make future historians kiss strangers. As twilight came on, the lecture steps forgot being a battlefield and remembered they were a classroom again. People sat. Vendors sold bread with citations. A professor resumed a postponed talk on the ethics of locks. Arya and Jace stood at the edge of their own story and watched it begin to teach other people how to tell theirs. Day 1 began with a map and a promise. The map was a fan of vellum pinned to the palace's public board, lines of ink crossing ink like arguments that had learned geometry. The promise was the Queen's. Disputes will be sung, spoken, drawn, and priced. It was a good promise because it admitted what most promises hide, that price is a language, and if you do not let it speak in the square, it will mutter in back rooms until it poisons water. The Duke's delegation brought engineers in jackets that tried not to be uniforms and failed. They unrolled diagrams for grain lanes and star corridors, showing how a treaty would slice travel time and save fuel, how tariffs would pay for bridges, how a fair split of river silt could turn the fringe farms lush. Their poets translated numbers into hunger relieved. The city liked hunger relieved. Arya stood with clerks and guild masters, asking the questions that made ink remember it had a body. Where does the silt go when river floods wrong? Which ships get the cheap lanes first? Whose bridges? The Meridian engineers answered in good faith more often than not. When they didn't, the poets leaned over their shoulders and invented better reasons. Jace watched the bodies, not the blueprints, the flares of temper that mean a man's pride is bargaining for his logic. The small relaxations that mean somebody's mind has been allowed to sit down. At noon, a guild of ferrywomen staged a demonstration. They'd learned to bind their flatboats together in storms and now, in sun, showed how the technique could be repurposed to ferry whole caravans across a broken stretch of river glass. The crowd cheered engineering born from weather instead of from the will of committees. The Duke applauded with honest pleasure. He was at his best when machine surprised him into humility. In the afternoon, a recessed square hosted a legal recital. The archive threw priest and plate and patient humming read-out sections of old law that would be bent by the treaty and ask the question treaties rarely invite. What do we lose that we cannot grow back? Arya answered some herself, naming rituals no contract had value enough to replace. The river blessing in midwinter, when the elders walk knee-deep and put their hands on the water. The summer plague rite where children break clay jars to remind pestilence that permanence is not polite. The Duke listened with a face that had learned to be respectful in public. 3 times his shoulders betrayed him into the small motion that means a man has decided to keep something he had planned to throw away. At dusk, a debate on conscription slid sideways into a street play staged by students who had finished their exams and were now drunk on the novelty of an audience that demanded they be serious. They acted the part of a mother who must choose which child to send east, and of a boy who would rather be poet than officer, and of a girl who would rather be officer than poet, and of a teacher trying desperately to write a curriculum that would keep their costs low and their funerals fewer. The Duke laughed once at a line that skewered him particularly well. He did not defend himself. Good men sometimes let jokes do the small cutting because they tire of doing the big. That night, Jace and Arya met in the Garden of Comets and sat back to back under the slow rain of light. They did not touch more than that. It is enough, sometimes, for spines to learn each other's weight. What did you keep? He asked. The silt, she said. The bridges. The oath that no child belongs to the meridian at 12. A beat? What did you like? The fairy women, he said. The boy who wanted to be poet. The girl who wanted to be officer. The way the Duke laughed at himself when he forgot not to. They too began with sickness. A caravan limped in with a fever that had learned how to hide under the tongue of the healthy. The city could have closed gates. The Queen opened wells instead and set up quarantine squares with shade and music, because hospitals sometimes cure faster when they remember they are places where bodies must want to live. The Meridian delegation sent physicians. A poet wrote a verse about boiling water that was so beautiful children began to do it on purpose. Arya spent the morning at the quarantine, masked, gloved, eyes clear. Jace stood at her back, the geometry of guard calming people who could not be calmed by words. Lutheran came quietly with a basket of citrus and did not speak until the mother had stopped shaking. Our academy taught me once to fear disease more than bullets, he said. Bullets are honest. Fever is a politician. Then we will outspeak it, Arya said. By noon, the archive declared the outbreak containable and asked the city to bring broth. Treaties paused themselves. People remembered the first agreement any civilization signs: keep one another alive. The poets wrote a second verse about spoons. The engineers built a hand-washing station that children wanted to use because it spun and glittered. In the afternoon, debate returned with teeth bared. The tariff schedules had been drawn with the Meridian's thumb on the scale. Arya called it out. The Duke did not pretend not to know. We begin from advantage, he said evenly. We are not saints. You are not alone either, she said. Right as if you expect to live next to me without soldiers. He adjusted a column. It was not enough. She moved whole rows. He frowned inside the mask in a way that made Jace like him again and distrust both of them for how easily that kept happening. At dusk, Jace walked the river glass while the city rehearsed being a future without breaking the present. He found a boy with a paper saber practicing the disarm he had used and showed him 3 versions safer than the one that would get him hurt. He let the boy win once, twice. The 3rd time he taught him how to lose and stand up smiling. He returned to find Arya in the lecture hall with the Queen, the room empty but for echoes of argument. The Queen had a map open on her lap, not of roads, but of loyalties. This one will break if pushed, she said, tapping a district. This one will bend and then call it tradition. This one still thinks your father left for noble reasons. He left because he was tired of being told he was not. Allowed to be human, Arya said. And because he was selfish, the Queen returned. Not cruel, not merciful, only accurate. Do not become interesting enough to yourself that you forget to be useful. Arya did not flinch. She kissed her mother's hair with the unceremonious love of daughters and went to sleep in a chair with her boots off and her crown humming. on a shelf like a well-behaved bee. Day 3 dawned with the sound of paper. Pamphlets like pale fish covered the steps. The case for 2 locks. The case for 1 key. The case for burning down the door. The archive hummed at the last with complicated disapproval. Jace collected a handful to line a drawer and keep for the day when some future child would ask what sincerity looked like before it learned patience. The final day's center was a table. Literally, a long, ugly, honest table dragged into the square and set upon blocks of stone so no one could say it tilted. The queen sat at one end, the duke at the other, Arya midway, where heat concentrates and choices become soup. The archive hung changes in tone on each speaking name, the way a clerk hangs ribbons on files to find them later. The city learned by color which voices were about to bruise and which would soothe. The first hour cut tariffs until they squealed, and then accepted the squeal as a sign of fairness. The second hour carved out a clause for a joint hospital paid for by both houses with oversight by neither military. The third hour broke on the ridge of conscription again and skidded, bloody-kneed, into a ditch. "Do not ask me to give you my children," Arya said. "Not loud, not theatrical. Ask me to give you my adults. Write me a path where a girl can choose officer without learning contempt as grammar. Write me a path," Lutheran returned, "where a boy can choose poet and not be fed to wolves when the wolves notice your poems do not stop teeth." "You kill wolves," Jace said from the edge, forgetting to be furniture. "You do not teach them poetry." The square laughed because men in iron do not like being reminded that their work is simple in principle and hard in practice. Lutheran looked at him, then at Arya. "Your guard is insubordinate," he said mildly. "He is correct," she said. "And mine." They wrote a clause that made officers of volunteers only, with a civic stipend that would make volunteering an actual choice and not an economic compulsion. They wrote a second clause requiring poets to teach marchers songs that made them remember home. They wrote a third allowing any soldier to be seconded to hospitals for a season as atonement and as education. The archive hummed a chord that will be quoted for a generation. By mid-afternoon, the table smelled like people and citrus and ink. Fights grew pettier as fatigue tried to win by outlasting goodwill. The queen adjourned for bread. Bread is politics. It resets what speeches desertify. In the pause, the adjutant who had been taxonomy at the lecture steps approached Jace with his mask tucked under his arm like a tame animal. "You are untrained," he said, not unkindly. "In the wrong schools," Jace agreed. "You will get my duke killed if you keep teaching him to like you." "I am teaching him to like my city," Jace said. "Same risk," the adjutant said, and left before Jace could decide whether to be offended. When they reconvened, the poets tried to sneak a metaphor into a legal clause and were gently beaten back by clerks who had buried enough men to know that imprecision is its own kind of knife. The fairy women were given a stipend to teach their binding technique to engineers too proud to ask. The fever receded enough for children to fight with sticks in alleys without their mothers snapping at them from windows. At last, the treaty lay on the ugly table like an exhausted animal that had decided not to bite if stroked correctly. It was not perfect. It was not terrible. It was, in the way of things that last, annoyingly practical, with 3 good surprises braided into it like the sweet in festival bread. The queen stood. "By witness of people," she said, "by witness of archive, by witness of those who will be hungry if we have lied to ourselves, by witness of those who expect to be disappointed and are choosing idiotically. To try not to be," the duke added, to the square's delighted shock. Arya lifted the stylus. The last time she had done this, the world had tilted, and a guard had become a verb. This time the world steadied. She signed. Lutheran signed. The queen signed as witness. The archive surface took the marks and kept them. A cheer rose and faltered, because the city is clever. It knows trouble does not end. It reschedules. The cheer resumed, softer and more useful. Vendors sold bread with citations. A child yawned in a way that made his mother feel like civilization might be working. In the swelling ordinary, a courier broke through with a face that had run before the rest of him could. "Raid on the East caravans," he gasped. "Banders, they heard we were busy. 2 wagons cut off grain and medicine." The square's mood turned like a page. Lutheran's hand went to a hilt and stopped, remembering rules. Arya did not look at Jace. Jace was already moving. "Take me," the Duke said, rawer than he had meant to be. "Let me pay you with something that does not have a clause." "Come," Arya said, already at the step. "We will teach wolves a grammar." They ran again into the light that had decided to love them. The archive dropped its tone a degree, from ceremony to purpose. The treaty lay drying on the ugly table, watched by clerks who had learned to kill with pens, and would do so again if anyone tried to steal the day. At the east gate, the world narrowed to a road and a horizon, and a problem of speed. The ferrywomen unbound their boats and lashed them again into a wide, shallow platform that could carry horses where river glass had cracked. The poets climbed aboard, because some men will insist on watching their metaphors work. The Queen's banner stayed furled. The one Arya raised instead was a plain cloth with a hand on it open, empty, ready. Jace checked his staff, and the ribbon he had tied near its grip, not his luck, but his memory. Luthrin loosened his shoulders and admitted, to himself, if to no one else, that he had missed the clean arithmetic of pursuit. Arya looked toward dust a day east, and smiled with the unsentimental affection of a farmer who knows where the rain will be and is already walking toward it. 3 days had made a table. Now they would see if it could be a road. The raiders had chosen their ground well. A stretch where the river glass had spidered into slick plates, and the old sand beneath had remembered it was a liquid with ambitions. 2 wagons sat canted at bad angles. Oxen panicked, wheels stuck in the grammar of braking. Banders ringed them with the loose, sharp posture of men who mistake hunger for permission. Their banners were not flags, but strips of cloth ripped from the caravans. Own tarps a blunt declaration that theft could be a country. Arya arrived with a wedge of guards, ferrywomen's platform underfoot, poets clinging to posts and trying not to look like ballast. Luthrin came off his horse at a run, iron editing the dusk into clarity. Jace leapt with the rest and landed like a sentence that intended to end exactly where it should. The banders saw iron and crown and chose bravado over retreat because pride is a cheaper drug than bread. Their leader, a man with the hands of a mason and the eyes of a tired dog, lifted a rusty spear. "These wagons owe us," he called. "The city eats while our children learn famine like a lullaby." "Bring them," Arya said, pointing at the wagons, ignoring the men as if they were weather. "We'll pull them with the platform." "You'll pull nothing," the leader spat. "We'll take the grain and dump your medicine and sell the vials for the pretty glass." Jace stepped to where his voice would travel. "Take the medicine," he said, and the banders blinked as if insult had been turned inside out. "Sell the grain if you must. Keep the vials and fill them with clean water. Heal a fever, and you will like the taste of being necessary." A laugh came from the banders right young, ready to be cruel. "Listen to the city man giving charity with other people's food." Luthrin's voice cut across at the angle mercy takes when it intends to be effective. "There are 30 of you," he said. "Plain arithmetic. There are 50 of us, and a platform that makes your ground our ground. You will not win a fight. Choose a bargain that lets you pretend later you chose well on purpose." Arya didn't raise her sword. She raised her hand, palm open, the banner she'd brought to the table in the road. "Give me the child you took," she said, "and we will feed you tonight. The wagons come with me." Mason Hands hesitated. His men muttered the way dice do in cups. Someone threw a stone. It skittered like an opinion. Jace moved first, because he had decided the night needed a narrator. He stepped between the raiders and the oxen, put the staff's ring under a wheel, and said, "Conversation as kitchen talk." Up, guards who had been waiting for a verb answered like grammar finding a subject. The wheel rose. The platform slid. The oxen found purchase in the idea of being rescued and became suddenly better at being animals. A bander lunged. Luthrin parried not with blade, but with a shove that taught the man where his feet were. Arya did not strike. She spoke, low and steady, to the mason's hands. "If you want to be poor tomorrow, make me your enemy today. If you want to be less hungry next season, help me move this wagon, and then come to the steps in the morning with a better argument than a spear." He stared at her like a man peering into a well and trying to decide whether the reflection was the person he wanted to be. He lowered the spear and used those good hands to lift the wheel. The fight did not break so much as deflate. The young cruel laugh swung at Jace with a chain. Jace took the hit on his sleeve, turned the chain into a line he could pull, and tripped the boy into the soft part of the world with enough gentleness that pride might survive to learn. 2 more tried a flank, and found a duke who had trained in corridors as narrow as this canyon of light and broken glass. He took their weapons without injury and threw them backward like bad ideas. Within a dozen breaths, the wagons were moving, and the banders were left holding the worst parts of themselves in their hands, confused. Mason Hands made a decision that would be called leadership later. He shouted, "Go!" and his men went, not fast enough to look proud, not slow enough to look brave. Arya didn't give chase. "Leave them a sack," she told the quartermaster. "Not as reward, as strategy. Hungry men come back stupid. Fed men come back with excuses good enough to be molded into law." The quartermaster nodded, grateful to be reminded that logistics is a moral science. They hauled the wagons onto safer glass. The ferrywomen took lines like goddesses of small miracles. The poets finally exhaled and began drafting 4 stanzas about leverage. The oxen decided to live. Chase checked the wounded. 1 guard with a cracked rib. 1 caravaner with a slice across the forearm. The boy who had swung the chain sat with his head in his hands, fingers digging into his hair as if to pull himself out of himself. "Name," Chase said, crouching. "Vic," the boy muttered. "Don't tell them. I'll tell them when you do it better," Chase said. "Come to the steps tomorrow. Stand next to the mason. Say why you did a foolish thing. If you run, you will do another. If you stand, you might get tired of being stupid." Vic looked up, surprised into a laugh. "You talk like a librarian." "Good people," Jay said. "Write their names in the margins. Come write yours." They ferried the caravan back toward the city as night tried to decide whether to be dangerous. Luthran rode at Arya's side, their horses choosing the same pace. "You chose well," he said. "Not eager, not grudging." "I chose a story that does not end with funerals," she said. "It will bore historians and delight the living." "I am tired," he said softly, "of delighting historians." They crossed the gate to a city that had learned the trick of staying awake without becoming unkind. Bread appeared, water, a bed that moved because it was carried by people, not by furniture. The queen waited at the lecture steps with a lamp and a ledger. "We recorded the treaty," she said. "We practiced saying it aloud until it stopped sounding like poetry and started sounding like policy. Then make room," Arya said. "We brought a sequel. Mourning made virtues look sensible again." The wagons unloaded into scales and lists. The mason arrived at the steps with his men and the expression of someone introducing a bruise. To the person who had caused it and planning to ask for an apology that would be worth the trouble. Vic came too proud to hide, too smart to swagger. The steps took them like a school, amidst latecomers stern and secretly pleased. Jace stood where he had stood for the duel. He did not lift his staff. He lifted his list. "We will not tolerate raid, but we will tolerate hunger telling the truth about why men risk disgrace." Names into the record. Work assigned. Payment issued. The city murmured in the rhythm of bureaucracy, which is to say, it steadied itself. The first petition of the morning involved water rights on a terrace where vines grew like gossip. The second concerned a disagreement between 2 temple kitchens about whose stew had medicinal properties and whose had only tradition. The third was the banders. Mason Hands removed his hat and held it like a bowl. He did not begin with excuses. "We did a wrong," he said, voice like bricks stacked carefully. "We did it because we are tired of staying alive accidentally. We want to stay alive on purpose." Arya asked the question that changes rooms. "What work do you want that we are not asking you to do?" Silence breathed. Men are not often asked to articulate the version of themselves they intend to maintain. The mason swallowed. "We can mend where glass has remembered sand. We can lay anchors under the river for the ferrywomen's bindings. We can teach boys to stack walls that stand without nails." He looked down at Vic, who was trying to look smaller while standing straighter. "We can stop teaching them chain." "Payment?" the queen asked the quartermaster. "A season's wage," he said. "Paid in bread and coin, docked for absences, increased for nights on call. Do you accept?" Arya asked the mason. He took too long to answer, because men who have been offered dignity often need a moment to believe it can be eaten. "I do," he said at last, and the square permitted itself a modest applause that felt like putting a roof on a house. Vic took a breath that made his ribs less decorative. "I hit a guard," he said, making it worse than it had been on purpose to bleed out the poison of self-flattery. I will scrub the latrines at the riftworks for a month. 2 weeks, Jace said. We punish to recalibrate, not to collect. 2, Vic said, as if negotiating with Mercy were a way to keep his pride alive. It is sometimes. Do I apply? You show up, Jace said, with a brush and ideas. A poet near the back wrote ideas as brushes and then crossed it out because it was bad. The Duke stood at the edge, mask tucked under his arm again, looking like a man who had found the part of himself that had never learned to applaud and was considering teaching it. We brought grain, he told the Queen Mother quietly. We kept medicine on the wagons. We fought where we had to and did not where we did not. Will your scribes find this acceptable? My scribes will find it in the record, she said. Acceptable is what patterns make after a while. He exhaled something he had borrowed from a younger version of himself. Then let us make a pattern. The day accrued small good decisions the way a decent cook accrues flavors in a pot. By afternoon, the treaty's edges had been tested by pettiness and held. By evening, the Queen read the day's summary from the balcony, while a girl sold mercy cakes, and a boy quietly handed out boiled water verses to old men who were too proud to read in public and too practical not to tuck the paper into a sleeve. Jace and Arya walked the garden paths that had pretended to be escape routes and now had decided to be promenades. The coronet hovered lower these days, not because the metal had grown heavier, but because choice had taught gravity to change its mind. You will be asked to love me, Arya said, an impossible sentence made oddly reasonable by the way the wind behaved. By the city, by my mother, by the record that likes its romances neat. I already do, Jace said, before caution could arrive with its usual brief. He did not dress it in metaphor. He put it on the path like a brick and stepped back so it could be seen for its shape. She stopped. The garden practiced being quiet. You said that as if the word were a tool. It is, he said. It fixes things. It pries. It holds. It can be misused. It is not a crown. It is a hand. She breathed like someone deciding not to drown in a shallow pool. I cannot pay you with a title. Good, he said, and laughed softly. I would only pawn it. She touched his sleeve near the cut he had taken for the space that had saved him. Do not be noble for me. Be stubborn. I have never been noble, he said. I have always been stubborn. They stood with their shoulders nearly touching, because nearly was wise and sufficient, and already more than the day had any right to give. Above them, the archive lowered its light a fraction, as if reading over their heads and underlining. This night cooled the city into something that could be slept in. On the East Road, wolves learned a clause, the kind that says if you come hungry, we will feed you and then ask your name, and if you come greedy, we will teach you a grammar that has no word for eat alone. In the morning, the table would be a road again. For now, the road allowed itself to be a table where two people set down the tools they had carried and admitted they preferred calluses to gloves, and honesty to stories, where one of them was ornament. The crown hummed along, content to be an accessory to a larger yes. The delegation returned to the Meridian with a treaty that tasted like compromise and a rumor that tasted like defiance. Papers traveled faster than ships. By the time Luthran rode into his capital, the forges already knew the shape of the clauses, and taverns argued whether mercy could be welded. The Academy received the packet about volunteers and pretended not to hiss. The council table longer, uglier, more honest than the one in the city waited with knives of rhetoric laid neatly beside plates. The Iron Meridian had taught itself to think of kindness as an alloy too soft for load-bearing use. It had not imagined kindness could be used to lubricate gears. It did not like surprises. Luthran placed the treaty on the table and removed his mask with the precision of a man removing a scar to show it had healed fine. We bargained in public for 3 days, he said. We fought raiders without killing them. We brought a caravan home while teaching future workers not to become future banders. We laughed at ourselves. It was unpleasant. It worked. The counselors looked like men who had been given soup when they had ordered meat and then realized the soup was exactly what their stomachs had needed. The eldest leaned forward. And the annex? She asked, voice like filament delicate, but the thing that makes light. Torn, he said, in front of the archive. We wrote that annex because we do not trust our sons, a younger snapped. We wrote it, Lutheran said, because we do not trust ourselves. Silence in a room of iron is heavier than elsewhere. The eldest broke it with a sound that might have been a laugh if fed differently. Then let us practice, she said. If the clause about volunteers holds, we will need a culture that does not punish boys for singing and does not punish girls for marching. And if the treaty fails, a merchant asked, eyes bright with the small arithmetic of tariffs, then we will have failed in front of an archive that never forgets. Lutheran said, I would rather be remembered for attempting difficult decency than for achieving easy cruelty. The Academy sent a letter on thick paper, folded like arrogance. It accused him of softness, warned that the boys would become poets who forgot to eat, predicted that officers would waste time washing hands between drills. Lutheran sent back a crate of soap, a volume of poems that had once kept a siege from becoming a massacre, and the schedule for hand-washing stations, built by engineers who had suddenly discovered hygiene, was an elegant machine. He attached, without comment, the boiled water verses the poets had written for children, and a note. Our soldiers will know which way germs travel. So will yours. He was not beloved for this. He was endured in the way competent people are in places addicted to drama. It was fine. He had come to prefer competence to applause. In a week, caravans moved with fewer knives visible. In 2, the fever burned out in 3 districts and did not cross the river. In 3, ferrywomen began to teach engineers to bind platforms with rope that did not mind the wet. In 4, a group of boys marched into the academy with songs about potholes and asked to study civil engineering because they liked the sound of a bridge that could hold its own arguments. And then came the letter with no seal. It did not travel officially. It traveled the old way, palm to palm, eye to eye, risk carried in breath. Lutheran read it in his private odd room, the one with books he did not let visitors see because they suspected he was learning from the wrong sources, and let his mouth do nothing while the rest of him decided to live differently. The letter was from a faction inside the Meridian Council that liked the treaty because it lowered tariffs and hated it because it raised the people. They would move. They would stage an incident at the city's lecture steps during the first quarterly review. A riot would do. A death would be better. Blame would fall where it is convenient to absolve violent men. On the young, on the foreign, on the wronged. The treaty would be declared too dangerous to maintain. The council would recall Lutheran for consultations and replace him with someone who liked iron as a personality more than as a tool. He packed a small bag with the kind of things you take when you intend to return and the kind you take when you don't know. He told the council he had been invited to a festival of bread with citations. He told his adjutant, who had learned taxonomy and loyalty, to prepare for 3 kinds of fight, with words, with bodies, with customs. The road between capitals got shorter when 2 people wanted to keep it open. He arrived to find the city already practicing being ordinary under stress. Guilds had scheduled extra water. The Queen had trained her smile to sharpen if needed. The archive had lowered itself a hand's breadth as if to hear better. On the steps, a stage stood ready, and a small forest of speaking horns made out of polished tin and stubbornness. Arya met him on the terrace, coronet humming at a pitch that made air pay attention. You rode faster than pride, she said, a greeting that doubled as compliment. I received an education in letters, he said. I came to submit my homework. Jace leaned in the arch's shadow, like a comma that prevents sentences from saying something they would regret. There will be a move, he said, without fanfare. There will always be a move, Lutheran said. Let us make it expensive. They planned without drama. Drama is for people without enough work. The Queen arranged the crowd so the young could be with elders who might lean on them instead of shove them. The archive seeded the square with notes that would harmonize if panic, Tron voice into weapon. The ferrywomen anchored ropes in case the steps wanted to remember gravity wrong. The poets wrote a bad poem about vigilance, and then a better one about cataloging your own fear. Quarterly review began with bread. Arya read a list of things that had worked, and the names of those who had done the boring labor to make them true. The square clapped the way people clap when they have learned without saying it aloud that applause is infrastructure. Jace presented a statement of failures and repairs. We missed a wheel at Outpost 7. We missed a beggar at Gate 3. We missed a lie and caught it the next day. He read each miss like a prayer. The city prayed back with nods. The move came in the third hour, because men who intend to hurt prefer the time of day when patience has lost its temper. A knot in the crowd tightened. A boy stumbled. A knife flashed with the idiotic joy of an object doing what it had been made to do. The scream rose and struck a chord hanging invisible in the air. The archive tuned the square. The scream became a note that went up instead of out. It cracked the moment in the right place. Lutheran was already moving. Jace was already there. Arya stood on the railing, so her voice could choose a direction. "Not today," she said, low enough that people would have to choose to hear her. "We will not let a knife write our minutes." The knife found a sleeve instead of a throat. The boy who had stumbled learned the moral physics of falling into a person who will not let you hit stone. The knot loosened, rope bit down. Elders leaned where elders are meant to. The would-be incident became 3 arrests and 1 apology and a paragraph in a report that would be boring to read later. Boring is a victory. The counselor's agents did not get their death. They were left with bread and a schedule and treaty clauses that refused to look ashamed. Lutheran watched their faces learn nothing and decided to change their environment instead. He asked for the horn. The queen gave it because the day liked coherence. He did not speak in meridian rhetoric or city lyric. He spoke like a man with a forge in his throat. "We have been strong," he said. "We have been proud. We have been cruel, because cruelty is quick. Today we were patient. We were prepared. We were kind because we decided to be. It worked. It will work tomorrow. Bring me better enemies than hunger and habit." The square laughed, and the laugh moved through people like water, finding its old course. Somewhere, a counselor ground a tooth down to a lesson. Night brought drums not of war, of kitchens. The review adjourned to tables, because policy digests better with soup. The Duke sat between a ferrywoman and a clerk who hated poetry, and told them both the same story about bridges. Arya circulated as queens do when they decide to be roads taking feet where they need to go without making people feel carried. Jace refilled water and put himself where he could take a blow without making it famous. The agents tried again, smaller, meaner. A rumor about poisoned bread. The quartermaster stood on a bench and took the first bite of every loaf and chewed with exaggerated gusto until children howled with joy. A whisper that the archive had replaced leaders with harmonics. The keeper led a tour behind the panels to show the wires and the dust and the very ordinary screws. A shove meant to topple a table with old men at it. Lutheran put iron under the table and let the shove teach its lesson to the shover's wrists. Under the safer moon, the queen asked for the day's final record. The archive sang a short, complicated hymn that will be quoted in bad movies for decades. It ended on a note that meant unfinished by design. Later, when even poets grew hoarse, when bread had been made into memory and the square into a map of tired people who would wait committed, Arya and Jace climbed to the balcony where they had learned to be honest in public. The coronet chose a place and stayed, the crown of kindness borrowed from a previous story, and now a circlet kept for days like this, rested on the rail between their hands. "You were almost killed," Arya said, "because courageous people must sometimes be told their risk was not noble, only unwelcome." "I was almost recorded as almost killed," Jace said, making the record behave by mocking it. "I prefer tea." "Tea," she agreed, and did not move away from his shoulder. "He came," she added after a moment, looking at the square where Lutheran laughed like a man who had remembered a young friend's name instead of an enemy's mistake. "He did," Jace said. "He will pay in council." "He already is," she said. He stayed anyway. They were quiet long enough to hear the city choose a bedtime. The archive dimmed to a domestic glow, the way a hearth makes itself smaller, so children will think they are safe alone while adults take the trash out. A stray dog made peace with a bench. A woman practiced a speech to tell her lover that she had decided against stairs and for doors. "Tomorrow," Arya said, "I will be asked to turn this into myth, a neat romance. A queen saved by a guard and made decent by an enemy. If you make it neat," Jace said, "we will have to live inside its corners. Leave it ragged. Leave our names misspelled 2 different ways in 2 different pamphlets. Leave a scene where we wash dishes." "We did wash dishes," she said, smiling. "Then give them that," he said. "If they tell our children we were perfect, our children will hate us for lying. If they tell our children we were stubborn and lucky and willing to be wrong loudly and then fix it. Our children might try. She turned and looked at him full, the way son looks at a window and decides to be inside without asking. Then Jace. Stubborn one, will you marry me publicly and privately and imperfectly, and with witnesses who will demand better of us on Thursdays? He did not stumble. He had practiced not stumbling on this answer without admitting it to himself. Yes, he said, and I will make you late to council once a season on purpose, so you remember who you are, and you will make me early to council always, so I remember who I work for. She laughed and kissed him. It was not tidy. It was infrastructural. Somewhere below, an old woman who had come to shout at tariffs and stayed to clap at decency cheered once, sharp, and then pretended she had sneezed. When they parted, the crown between their hands hummed at a pitch that means indexed. The archive made a notation softly enough that it would be found only by historians who bothered to read footnotes. The city turned over and put an arm over its own waist, like a person who had at last taught their body a grammar for sleep. At dawn, the treaty would be tested by routine again. At noon, a boy would trip and not cut himself on the glass because another boy would catch him. At dusk, wolves would look at a campfire and decide it was a wall written in heat. And somewhere along that ordinary day, a queen would smile at a guard, and a guard would roll his eyes at a queen, and two councils would practice being bored by peace, which is the most radical curriculum any empire can adopt. The wedding was scheduled to be ordinary on purpose. No comet processions. No swords crossed over heads, like threats that had forgotten their lines. The queen insisted on the lecture steps instead of a cathedral. The archive approved by lowering itself a finger width, the way a careful elder leans closer when children are reading out loud. Benders argued over who would supply bread with citations. The fairy women bound a platform into a stage, because construction is a vow in wood. The poets were placed far enough to avoid improvisation during vows, and near enough to be forgiven later. Jace woke before bells and found the city practicing quiet doors half open, voices tempered, brooms making neat borders nobody would notice unless absent. On the balcony rail, the circlet that had once been borrowed as crown of kindness sat humming like a kettle, deciding to serve one more cup. He washed, wrapped his forearm where an old cut still told weather, and carried the circlet because hands remember what heads forget. Down in the garden, dew collected in the grooves of stone like marginalia. Arya met him where the colonnade learns to be a corridor. She wore travel white cloth that stains, and therefore dares the day to be civil, and a coronet that hovered so low it convinced light to behave. There were no jewels. There were seams stitched by the same fingers that had patched cloaks before raids, and by those hands that had tightened straps before debates. She looked like someone who had chosen a job that happened to be a life. Cold? He asked. Accurate, she said, smiling. Accuracy passes for comfort after a while. They walked the long way because history likes a longer sentence before a period. On the steps, the queen stood with a ledger instead of a scepter. Luthran waited down in the square, iron polished to a neighborly compromise. The Banders were there with new rope burns and clean boots. Vic had a brush tucked in his belt like a promise. Children brandished wooden staffs. They were not allowed to swing and did not. The keeper raised both hands, sleeves rolled, ink under nails. Witness, as ever, they said, by light and by ledger, by the people who will have to live with this, even after festival bread is gone. Laughter moved through the crowd like a friendly cat. The vows were not poetry. Poetry had done enough work. They were lists that meant intimacy because they admitted logistics. I will be late and tell you early. I will say when I am wrong while the being wrong is still small. I will not turn you into a symbol when I am tired of being one. I will love you like a tool that fixes and not a flag that hides. When the keeper asked for objections, the city performed the most radical act at those. It withheld drama. A boy sneezed. A bell rang somewhere off-key and then corrected itself. Luthran took a step forward and set a small iron box on the stage. From the meridian, he said, a wedge we use to keep doors from swinging shut when we carry weight through them. For the palace. For the treaty. For your marriage. Arya lifted the lid, laughed, because the gift was shamelessly literal, and put the wedge on the step between her and Jace. Accepted, she said. If it vanishes, we'll know which counselor stole it. Vic cleared his throat as if volunteering to spoil surprises were now his job. I'll sit on the step if it goes missing, he called, and the square gave him the gentle applause cities, reserved for people who had decided to stay. Rings were not metal, but thread-dull silver looped 3 times, tied once by the Queen, once by Lutheran, once by a child chosen by lottery, and Kitty with the responsibility of not. The archive sang a short note the way a library stamps a book, with affection, with order. Kisses are difficult to describe without lying. This one was public and careful, and entirely theirs. It made 2 old women cry into their sleeves, and 3 young men vow to learn to apologize before autumn, and a professor decide to retire at last. Because the city clearly had enough teachers now. When they parted, the crown hummed like a room whose acoustics have been fixed. After vows come chores. Bread was passed. Water was poured. The first dispute of the day, over a market stall's shade, was settled with a borrowed wedding ribbon used as measuring tape. Lutheran endured congratulations, like a man who has learned to prefer usefulness to praise. The Queen let herself be hugged by a child sticky with mercy cake. Then the thing happened that all good days leave room for, unscheduled need. A tremor ran through the stones under Outpost 7, the same hum Jace had once learned to hear as a request. Not danger, not collapse. Something out of alignment that would become trouble if given time. The keeper looked at Arya. Arya looked at Jace. Jace looked at his sleeves and decided ceremony had been sufficiently observed. Go, the Queen said, already rolling up her own cuffs. They went with a procession of happily conscripted wedding guests, fairy women, an engineer who wanted to show off a new anchor, 2 poets who insisted song could be a tool and then proved it, and a handful of banders who had learned that carrying weight makes you part of rooms you could not previously enter. Lutheran came too, iron tucked under a linen shirt, like a polite secret. Under the outpost, the stabilizers had drifted by a breath. Nothing glory would fix. Everything attention would. They tuned. They hummed. They swore gently when a bolt argued and praised it when it relented. Arya sang the walking song that had taught the rift to choose smaller mouths. The archive listened with the indulgence of an ancestor and the pride of a teacher who recognizes their own lesson improved. Weddings, Lutheran said dryly, tightening a clamp, are a chance to check your foundations. Entreaties, Jace said, counting heartbeats into torque, are a chance to decide we will do that in public. They finished before the cake found its second life as breakfast. When they came back up, the city had not missed them. That is the best proof of governance. The world keeps its rhythm when you step out for a moment to fix a leak. The rest of the day, learn to be lazy on purpose. Dignitaries grew bored with their own importance and bought candied figs. The adjutant who had warned Jace once about taxonomy lost an argument with a child about whether bridges were better than ferries and enjoyed losing. Someone hung the iron wedge on a nail beside the steps and painted the word open under it in 3 languages. At dusk, Arya and Jace finally allowed themselves a corner under the colonnade where shadows behaved. They took off thread rings and then tied them on again, once more for themselves. Redundancy is romance. Tomorrow, Arya said, we go back to meetings. Good, Jace said. I like the kind of love that has minutes. And late arrivals? She asked. Once a season, he said, and for honest reasons. She kissed his knuckles. The archive dimmed, a house lowering its voice when the children have fallen asleep on couches and armchairs, and nobody intends to carry them to bed until the story ends of its own accord. The first year did not become legend. It became work. That was the point. The volunteer clause held, creaked, was patched, held again. The academy wrote a new curriculum in which poets taught cadence to marchers, and marchers taught poets how to breathe when afraid. The fever did not return. Other fevers tried, and were met with the bored competence of people who had practiced washing hands in a way that made children feel it was something heroic. The fairy women's bindings became standard. Engineers pretended the idea had been theirs, and the fairy women let them have the pretense in exchange for budgets. The banders built anchors until their palms had the geography of labor. Vic learned to measure by ear how tight a rope should sing. On the anniversary of the raid, he cut his chain into short lengths and sold them as plant hangers. The city bought out his stock before noon. He slipped 1 coin into the donation box at the Garden of Comets, with the look of a man paying rent to a better version of himself. Lothran fought in council for the things he had promised, and lost half of them, and kept the other half by teaching Los to be quiet. He became known grudgingly, accurately, as the Duke who could be bored by peace and still show up to vote for it. He visited once a month and was made to eat bread with citations. He never smiled at the word. He always asked for seconds. The Queen grew sharper and kinder in the same places, which is a rare trick usually only accomplished by Rivers. She read lists at the balcony with the pleasure of a woman who has learned the names of her tools. She confessed mistakes publicly with the accuracy of a craftsperson who intends never to make the same cut twice in the wrong place. Arya and Jace discovered that love has a schedule. Mornings with tea, handed back and forth like signatures. Afternoons where policy tasted like dust, and they held each other's tempers steady. Evenings with walks that looked like celebrations from far away and were actually audits. Once a season, he made her late. More often, she made him early. They left a public fight unresolved one night and returned to finish it in front of witnesses because the city had learned that privacy can be a lie when used to launder harm. They were forgiven. They forgave more. In the second year, a storm like a history book came across the dunes, turned sand into knives and roofs into opinions. The river glass cracked in patterns no engineer's pride had predicted. The archive sang low, pulled its light tight like a shawl. People moved in the direction they had been taught, toward one another. Anchors held, ropes bit. The Queen's voice came thin and then thicker. Jace's hands remembered the way a staff is a lever and not a sword. Arya sang the old walking song, the one that maps a path through panic. Lothran laughed into the wind once because the only other choice was to curse, and he had been disarmed of that habit. When it passed, the city counted itself and found it had lost windows and kept lives. It wrote gratitude into policy. It repaired in public. The poets failed 3 times at a good stone poem, and then wrote a 4th that refused to be performed and was printed small to be kept in drawers for later. Years stacked. The treaty frayed and was mended. A girl who had watched a duel from a rail joined the academy and graduated with a paper on rope harmonics and a habit of telling officers their shoes were tied wrong. A boy who had learned to wash pots with dignity opened a kitchen where stew and statutes were discussed with equal vigor and cheaper wine. On the 10th anniversary, the wedge was taken down and burnished and placed on the steps again with the same informal solemnity as the first time. The keeper read aloud the original list of vows and the amendments that had made them better, one by one, as if reciting recipes. People clapped at the boring parts because they had learned boredom was a virtue that keeps doors from making enemies of hands. Near evening, Arya and Jace returned to the Garden of Comets. They looked older in the interesting ways. Lines like notes, gray like edge highlights, scars catalogued and set into good order. The coronet still hovered, lower now by habit rather than need. The circlet of kindness sat crooked on a bush where a child had left it during a game and forgotten to feel guilty. Would you do it again? Jace asked, the ritual question. Yes, Arya said, and sooner. What would you change? I would learn the names of the fairy women faster, she said, and kiss you before the second duel, not after. He laughed. We were busy. We are always busy, she said, and kissed him anyway, because rituals are for making room. The archive lowered itself a touch. The light fell in slow comets. The city took a breath as one body, the way it has learned to do when it intends not to be heroic, but to be decent. A small procession came down the path, 3 children carrying a ledger too big and a basket too light, and the weightless dignity of messengers. From the Queen Mother, the smallest said, serious. For the footnote, inside the basket was a wedge. Wood, not iron, carved with vines by hands that have learned how to make stubbornness look like ornament. On its side, a single word, cut deep and painted the color of pomegranate. Open. Arya set the wedge beneath the nearest gate. Jace checked that it held. The gate stayed where it had been asked. The path ran through as if choosing people were its only job. When night took over, it did so gently. Lamps became constellations. The crown hummed the pitch of a home that is not shy about being home. Somewhere in a kitchen, water boiled without being told a poem, and a woman added salt, because love always needs salt. A bander's grandson fell asleep on a rope coil and dreamed not of raids, but of bridges and of the satisfying sound a knot makes when it declares itself correct. The archive indexed the day not as an ending, but as a useful chapter in a manual that future strangers would inherit and pretend they had written. The city let them. In the morning, there would be a petition about a cat that believed itself to be a citizen, and a clause would be drafted to accommodate her, because the law had learned to enjoy being hospitable. And on the steps plain stone, honest ware, the wedge snug under the hinge two people who had been called many names would stand again and be what mattered most. A door that stays.